Also very excited about our next talk, which is about identity, which is a topic that Jonny Howle, who's our presenter, is very familiar with. He's going to talk us through the future of identity and weaving together Web3 identity and adoption. So please give Jonny a warm welcome.
Hello, check. All right. Okay. So thanks everybody for coming to listen about identity and actually a bunch of kind of other things. I'm trying to weave them all together into one kind of coherent vision for how Ethereum and Web3 can gain adoption by building identity the right way. It's going to cover a lot of topics: privacy, trust, network effects, a lot of usability. And it's a little bit more of a conceptual talk as opposed to, I'm not going to be writing any code up here or anything like that. First things first, so I'm Jonny, I'm a product designer on uPort. I've been working on identity for about a year and a half now, maybe close to 2 years. And being part of uPort and having uPort integrated here at ETH Denver, I encourage anybody who wants to come give us feedback on how it was to use uPort to either yell at us or give us a high five if you see us in person. We'll probably be over there at that table most of the time. Or you can find me on our dedicated outrage channel, which is Twitter at JohnnyAustinTX, if you want to yell there. So uPort, what is it? In a nutshell, we want to make self-sovereign identity practical, usable, universal. There's a lot of other things that go into that, but I think that those attributes kind of describe the overall vision pretty well. This is the big statement that kind of encapsulates this presentation, which is, I think the way that we handle identity will make or break Web3. It's not inevitable that Web3 generates the self-sovereign identity we want. There's other avenues that we could go down that are better or worse for users. Obviously, Web2 didn't end up handling identity the way we wanted it to. And I don't think Web3, it's a given. So I think we have to build it, and we have to build it the right way with some principles in mind. So I spoke about identity a little bit at DevCon. I wanted to recap some of those concepts, which this kind of builds on. It's around identity, trust, reputation, privacy, a little bit about ethics and things like that. So I'll run through that pretty quickly here. All these kind of dots, you can think of those as representing the different identities you have. You don't have one identity. Identity isn't this essential quality. It's kind of like an emergent thing, a thing that we say when we're talking about any set of data or information that refers to some individual. Obviously, you can have devices can have identities and things like that, but for the sake of this, for usability, we're talking about what it means to be a person online. So you have all these different contexts. Maybe you're anonymous on some gaming platform. You have a different identity with your family, with the people you work with. And all of those things kind of interact, merge, morph, and form who you are as how you understand it subjectively as your identity. And that's what we're attempting to deal with online. So identity kind of manifests itself in some cascading spheres. So you have this individual identity, which is the easiest thing for you, that you intuitively understand. And then you have these other layers: social, digital, decentral, sovereign. Social is super important to something like Ethereum, peer-to-peer technology. And it's interesting because this is where reputation and trust emerge out of the concepts of identity. And how do our identities interact with each other? So I would say that identity multiplied by time gives us reputation. It gives identity some valence, gives it a direction. It helps us gives us 2 points on whatever graph, and helps us make predictions about how an identity might act in the future. And I would say that that's really what we care about. We care about reputation more than what we often refer to reputation as identity. But there's a little nuance there, and I think online what we care about is reputation. And uPort doesn't bill itself as a reputation platform per se, but I think that this is essentially what we're all trying to do. We care about identities insofar as we care about what they're going to do in the future. Can we trust them, and to what degree? Let's go, keep it moving. Okay, so the way this relates and is important to us. Cryptocurrencies, blockchains, all of these things are peer-to-peer technologies, an identity interacting with another identity. Now, the interesting thing, and this is Indiana Jones attempting an atomic swap in real life, which he wasn't able to pull off if you've seen the movie. And that's the thing. For most things that we want to do to change the world with these technologies, we can move the assets in this atomic swap fashion, right? No trust needed. Either both happen, either the debit and the credit happens, or neither happen, right? In real life, you can't do this with physical goods and services, so you get this asymmetry, right? You get trustlessness in the movement of the asset, and then you have to have some sort of trust architecture built on reputations and identities for the movement of the good or service you're attempting to pay for. And I would say that this asymmetry actually makes the process worse, right? When you can't reverse the transaction, it makes the amount of trust you need to move the good even higher, because there's no reversal of the money. It's easier for somebody who gets you to send Bitcoin and then doesn't give you the good to get away with that. So we need to do something to mitigate this. So no atomic swaps in real life. I think the role of identity is often overlooked when we're thinking about the mechanics of trading. This is a side note. If you're familiar with GDPR, it's a big deal in Europe. It stands for General Data Protection Regulation. And essentially what it means for people working in this industry is you don't want to put any personal identifying information online. Not only is that a risk legally, it's also just probably a bad practice. It's worse than even what the data aggregators that we dislike are doing. So I would be careful of that. So to wrap up this front portion, everything is reputation. That's what we care about. All the data around identities help to serve the building of reputation. And reputation is the basis of trust. It is our trust. So, what are the possible futures for Web3 as it comes to identity, data, how we handle it? So there's three that I can kind of think of. There's a Zuckerberg future. You can imagine a scenario where Facebook allows you to log into dApps, but they hold on to your keys. They sign the things for you. They attach all of the things you do on Web3 to your Facebook profile. And then we get the adoption we want for if you're a dApp and you want users, you get your users, but we have just re-entrenched all the terrible things about Web2 into Web3. And we don't want that to happen. But it could happen, and people are going to try and make that happen. There's also the China vision, the Xi Jinping vision of identity. So if you're not familiar, China has a pilot program out right now called the Social Credit Score. And what this does is China watches everything you do, all your private messages, when you shop, what you buy, where you go, and all of this is filtered in to an overall reputation algorithm that's not transparent. You have no recourse to it. And essentially, it's a control and surveillance mechanism. This is what I fear if we put personal identifying information on chain. What we've built, if we do that, what we'll build is a globally accessible surveillance network, like an immutable Palantir on steroids. And I don't think that that's what we want. What we want is this self-sovereign future, but it's not inevitable, so we have to build it. So what are we willing to do for adoption? Are we willing to do anything? I would say no. I think that there are some standards and some principles we should have when we're thinking about dealing with identities in Web3. So this is a trilemma. It's similar to Zuko's triangle, but it's a little bit more aimed at identity. So we have this usability, privacy and sovereignty, and there's this gap in the middle where these things don't overlap. So an example of usability and privacy, that might be something like your encrypted messaging apps, Telegram, WhatsApp, Signal, Wire, something like that. You have usability and sovereignty. This is something like a system that puts your information on chain, right? You're still sovereign. It's pretty usable because dApps can just look at the chain and get the information they need to do what they want. And then you have privacy and sovereignty. And I think that this is pretty well represented by something like PGP, which I wanted to talk about. So PGP is a really good case study for us to look at. PGP stands for pretty good privacy. It attempted to allow people to use a key pair to sign messages in email and send those messages to some other key pair where they could decrypt. Now, this is John Callis on Twitter in 2015 talking about why PGP never took off. He says, "We have done a good job of teaching people that crypto is hard, but cryptographers think that UX is easy. And PGP works. It's just not usable for regular people. And there's no guarantee that our key management and the way we handle encryption and messaging and all of these things in Web3 is going to be any easier. I don't want to see us go the same route as PGP." This is Tim Berners-Lee. He's talking about the failures of PGP. He also believes that the reason PGP failed was because of usability. He says the workflow was horrible in many places, like you need to do X in a dialog box, but there was no link or a button or an explanation on how to do X. He went on to say you had to do this tedious multi-step process, download someone's key, blah, blah, blah. You didn't know what any of it meant. And this ultimately was why PGP never took off. So how do we avoid that? How do we find this overlap between these three spheres and solve the unsolvable trilemma? Well, uPort and other people in the space believe that it can be solved. And I think we solve that with Ethereum. Ethereum now makes this solvable. So I want to talk about network effects and why solving it in the right way is key to seeing this mainstream adoption, to seeing all the apps and the dApps that are being built upstairs actually get users. So Joe Lubin says this, and I think it's right. I think the thing that Ethereum can do is it has this different character to the network effects that can emerge if people are owning their own data and can move it at will. So this is your typical network effects. Over time, as you accrue users, the value of your platform goes up with every additional user. We have this second order of network effects where the network can go up with every new dApp and every new user, right? These two things start to create an extra feedback loop that return positive value to the network and increase adoption at a faster rate. So we've actually seen this type of compounding network effect before. And that's kind of represented by Facebook. So when Facebook, and there's lots of other OAuth users out there, so you can log in with GitHub, you can log in with LinkedIn, log in with Google. But these types of things were great for usability on the web. They reduced the barriers to entry or the barriers to use for tons of apps and websites. One-click sign-up. The problem is that you don't own your own data, and you typically overshare. So there's two things that Facebook does to lock their users in. Why the usability is great, but it comes at our cost. First thing they do is they build up a locked-in reputation. They don't make it easy for you to go use a Facebook competitor, right? So if some Facebook competitor comes out, they're not going to just put a login with Facebook button on the Facebook competitor and allow you to port all of your data into it. Then they decrease barriers to use with approved applications. This is the UX, right? They keep you in Facebook because of how good this UX is. 78% of people, when presented with the option to log in with Facebook Connect, choose that. So we have sovereignty of Ethereum, we have the privacy of PGP, and we need the usability of something like Facebook Connect. So this is where I think Web 3, if we can do those things, Web 3 actually will surpass the Web 2 value because we'll be able to decrease the switching costs. So when you own your own data, you decrease the switching costs from one app to another. Right now in Facebook, the switching cost is incredibly high. You have to rebuild your identity and rebuild your reputation on some other platform. Nobody wants to do that. All their friends are there, all their photos are already there, and they don't make that easy. But if you owned your own data, switching costs, approach zero, which means competition moves to the user experience level, and we get a more perfectly competitive market. So here's what that looks like. This graph is kind of a take on Clayton Christensen's disruptive innovation model. So the important things about this are this space in the middle, right? Maximum performance needed, minimum performance required. You can actually overbuild, and this is like clearer TVs that even eyes can't detect, right? Great, it's objectively a better TV, but it serves nothing to the end users. And then you have a minimum performance required. So I put this orange dot here to kind of represent where we are, and now that I look at it, I think it's pretty ambitious to put it there. I don't know that we're there yet. I think people in this room find that Ethereum provides the minimum performance required for a lot of things, but for mainstream users, I don't even know that we've made it there. But the key thing is, the web is actually getting worse as data aggregates and we see all the hacks and all of the data breaches. Web 3 can keep that from happening if we build it the right way. And we have to get some separation before the switching costs are worth it. It's not going to happen just at the point where we cross over Web 2. We actually have to do, I don't know what the estimates are, 10x better or something like that to induce a switching cost. But because of the interesting nature of Ethereum and the way self-sovereignty can work in this ecosystem, we can actually get that separation, I think. Here's an example of how uPort thinks that this could happen. So you have a user, and they're going to use uPort. And they want to use Ujo. Let's say they're a musician. Let's say, for the sake of this, they're kind of, like many of us, interested in a number of things. They do programmatic music, right? So they know some tech, they code, they make music out of it, they post it on Ujo. So let's say they do that, and Ujo sends back to them the data, the reputation that they've accrued on Ujo for them to store. Now, that is pretty typical of app experiences. You might even say that's harder than a Web 2 app. The key is, as you move forward, it gets easier and easier and easier. So if you have uPort and you go and Cowrie integrates with uPort, for instance, and Cowrie wants to, or on Cowrie, our user wants to write an article about how to do this programmatic music that they've done, right? They can come to Cowrie without Cowrie needing to talk to Ujo. They can bring their reputation, the songs that they're referring to, proof that they created them, proof of how popular they are, and bring that as evidence of why you should listen to me about this topic, right? And nobody can stop them from doing that. Then you keep going. Then you go to Gitcoin. Maybe you see a bounty for some Python bounty, and you write your music in Python. You can bring with it the fact that you have written an article on this on Cowrie, and Cowrie doesn't have to talk to Gitcoin. You can just do it yourself, and nobody can stop you. And this goes on and on and on. So bounties. Now you want to, fulfill a bounty for some musical score that's written programmatically. You then want to go to Civil. You want to apply. This is an interesting one. So Civil's really based on reputation. So if you wanted to apply to Civil's newsroom and have people vote on whether or not you should be in, all of this data that you own now can be brought to Civil. Nobody can stop you from bringing that data to Civil. And you can use that to elevate your standing on their platform and bootstrap your reputation. And then finally, let's say you go to Opolis and you want to apply for a job. This data now that you've collected, or that our users collected, is probably more robust and more valuable than any resume could ever be. And the reason this is different from Web 2 is that you would imagine let's say Facebook in the middle there. And what would happen is these lines would be connected between the dApps, right? So they would have to, if you wanted to get your Ujo information to Cowrie in Web 2, well, Cowrie or Ujo needs to build some API or something like that to allow Cowrie to pull that information, right? And that is a ton of developmental overhead. And that is what decreases it increases the friction and it decreases the network effects and it increases the barriers to exit and increases the barriers to try. So the interesting thing about Web3 is if you own your own data, as soon as you onboard for one compelling use case into the dApp world, you're already onboarded, essentially, you're one click away from onboarding and bootstrapping your reputation on every other single dApp. And that is just a fundamentally different change, and it's going to speed up the adoption of Web3. So it takes us along this curve, right? So as that happens, we get to move up here. I think that that's the most important thing. And if we build that, we can see the mass adoption that we want. We can see every dApp up there that gets a user, make it very easy for all of the work they put in that dApp's context to be valuable in any other interesting context. And no developers have to get involved in making that bridge work, right? It happens just by virtue of building a dApp. And I think that's how we get to mass adoption. So thank you. You can find me there again at Jonny Austin TX. I don't know if we have any time for questions. Vivek? Question time? Good? Cool. How's it go? Yeah. Oh, is there like a, oh, there's a mic. Okay, cool.
Thank you for a great speech. My name is Ivan Ivaninsky from Smart Deck. Let me bring in a little analogy between data ownership and permissions for mobile applications. So when you install a new application, it asks you, for instance, for access to SMS and so on. Most of people just press it without reading, even if, for instance, game wants access to photos and SMS and so on.
Right.
So uPort gives people an ability to own their own data and not to give it to some other applications, while Facebook doesn't. The question is, do people really need that? Or maybe most of the people will just give their data and don't care about this feature, which I consider very important.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And this is why I called out that Zuckerberg future. I think there's this thing we talk about a lot called the privacy paradox, right? Sure, everybody's heard of all the hacks and all of that, but I'm sure many of you, I won't make you raise your hands, probably still have Facebook. I still have Facebook, and I work on this. And that is a hard user experience problem to solve. Now, the privacy paradox paints this paradox as intractable, right? That's unsolvable. I actually think it's just a matter of switching cost, right? It's just a matter of how much more value is out there in a platform that is self-sovereign, right? Like Web3 could be. So one thing that we focus on in the design and that we're testing, and we've been testing, is how to get around this dark pattern of hitting users with a wall of information, making them feel helpless to understand or read it all, and just hitting accept, right? Because they're already invested, and oversharing. Facebook counts on this, right? They've had pushback from regulators and things to make it easier, but they're doing the bare minimum. And some applications, like LinkedIn, I think, they just give you kind of like a summary, like, oh, this application will get your basic profile data. No user knows what basic profile data is. And yeah, that's a hard user experience problem to solve. That's where design comes in, right? If you want to give users control, you have to give them the controls to do it. And yeah, it's not easy. Something we're working on, zero-knowledge proofs and non-reusable proofs that like IDEN3 is working on and things like that can help mitigate this and make it less reliant on the user experience designers to make sure that this doesn't happen. But yeah, it's an ongoing problem, and it's definitely not completely solved at all.
Thank you.
Yep. One more? Sure.
I think you outlined why people should use uPort, but not how you're going to get people to use this one app in a sense.
Right.
It's difficult to market that kind of thing.
Yeah. So one way is to integrate with an event you want to go to, and so people have uPort. The other way is, one is just a user experience question. We want to make it as easy as possible to get started with uPort. People are used to downloading apps. Of course, they're inundated with them now, so you have to kind of provide that value up front as soon as possible and make it very clear. That's a little bit of a chicken and the egg scenario. But I want to stress that uPort also is not, it's open source, right? So if somebody wants to use what uPort has built and uPort identities in some medical context, right? Maybe that's how you onboard, is to maintain your medical records. Somebody can go build a uPort-like app that generates uPort IDs and does all the signatures and all of that stuff, and does verified credentials for medical contexts, and they can onboard users that way. Now, we want to make it trivially easy that if they want to expand and take that medical identity that they've been asked to have by their doctors or whatever, to take it to other contexts. They can port that very easily just into the uPort native app that's use case agnostic, right? So there's a couple routes there. We are also counting on the competition at the application layer to build the best user experiences for very specific use cases that take advantage of self-sovereign identity. We just want to make it, as you accrue identity in different contexts, where do you want to aggregate it to? And that's why the uPort client exists. So it could happen a couple of routes. We're obviously trying to get adoption at events and things like that, organic adoption, but their adoption might also come from these other avenues where you're serving some very high-value purpose at first, and then now, just as a bonus to the user, they already have a self-sovereign identity set up, and now they can use it across all these interesting dApps, right? So I think that could also help aid in us scaling up our user base. And it's not really our user base, right? We want to make uPort a protocol, a standard, right? And I think we'll be happy if you're using a decentralized medical records app that's built on uPort's identity protocol, just as happy about that as we would be if you downloaded our app.
Thank you, Johnny. Cheers.